There was a time when the name AEC did not need explaining. It was stamped into the machinery of everyday Britain. It sat beneath the red buses that crossed London. It powered lorries that carried goods through industrial towns. It appeared on vehicles that worked in war, in commerce, in public transport, and in the quiet daily movement of millions of people. For generations, AEC was not just a manufacturer. It was part of the physical language of the road, and yet, if you go looking for the great AEC factory today, the noise is gone. The works at Southall, once spread across a vast triangular site between Windmill Lane, the Great Western Railway, and the branch line toward Brentford Dock, no longer exists as the industrial landmark it once was. The main works were demolished after closure, and the production site became part of a different industrial landscape. The sign that once told railway passengers they were passing the builders of London's buses belongs now to memory. This is the strange power of the AEC story. A company can help define the image of a capital city. It can build machines that become symbols. It can produce vehicles trusted by operators, drivers, soldiers, engineers, mechanics, and passengers. It can become so familiar that people stop noticing it, and then slowly the name can disappear. The question is not only why AEC closed. The deeper question is how a company so embedded in Britain's transport life could lose its place inside the very industry it helped create. To understand that, the story has to begin before Southall, before the Routemaster, before Leyland, and before the factory gates fell silent. It begins with a problem on London streets. At the beginning of the 20th century, London was growing, spreading, and moving faster than the old transport system could comfortably handle. Horse buses had carried the city through an earlier age, but the modern capital demanded something more durable, more regular, and more scalable. The streets were crowded. The population was expanding. The suburbs were reaching outward. People needed to travel farther, more often, and with greater reliability. The answer was not simply to buy motor buses from elsewhere. Early motor vehicles could be unreliable, and London's traffic placed unusual strain on anything expected to survive daily urban service. A bus in London was not a showpiece. It was a working machine. It had to start in the morning, take punishment all day, stop and start through dense traffic, and then return to the garage ready to be maintained and sent out again. That need helped create the engineering culture that would become AEC. The London General Omnibus Company began building its own motor buses at Walthamstow. The B-type, introduced into service in 1910, became one of the decisive machines in this early story. London Transport Museum describes it as the world's first reliable mass-produced motor bus. It used interchangeable parts, was designed to meet weight limits, and was built to cope with London roads and traffic. By 1914, nearly 2,500 B-types were operating across 112 routes, covering more than 1,300 route miles. That is the first important layer in the AEC story. AEC did not begin as a romantic brand created around image. It began as a practical answer to a transport problem. London needed buses that could survive London. The company that became AEC grew out of that discipline: build for use, build for maintenance, build for the street, not for the showroom. In 1912, after the London General Omnibus Company came under the Underground Electric Railways Company of London, a dedicated chassis building company was established, the Associated Equipment Company, better known simply as AEC. The official name was formal, almost anonymous. Associated Equipment Company. It sounded more like a department than a legend, but the initials would become famous. The First World War then widened the company's meaning. London's buses were not only urban vehicles, they became wartime machines. More than 1,000 London buses were deployed for service on the Western Front, carrying troops and serving in other military roles. The transformation was symbolic. A vehicle designed for city routes became part of a national war effort. A bus that had once carried clerks, workers, families, and shoppers through London could be painted khaki and sent into a very different world. This early period gave AEC something that every serious manufacturer needs: credibility earned under pressure. Its machines had worked in the capital. They had worked in war. They had worked not because they were glamorous, but because they were dependable. After the war, the old factory at Walthamstow was no longer enough for what AEC was becoming. The company needed space. It needed a modern industrial home. It needed a works large enough for the scale of commercial vehicle production that the interwar years demanded. That place was Southall. In 1926, AEC moved from Walthamstow to a new purpose-built factory at Southall in West London. The first Southall chassis were completed in early 1927. The site was large, roughly 25 hectares, and placed beside important transport arteries, Windmill Lane, the Great Western Railway, and the Brentford Dock branch. That location mattered. Factories of this kind were not only buildings, they were machines made of brick, rail access, road access, labor, supply chains, and routine. Raw materials arrived. Chassis moved through the works. Engines, frames, axles, cabs, and components became finished vehicles. Men entered through the gates with lunch tins and tools. Finished machines left for operators who depended on them. The Southall Works became more than a production site. It became a landmark. For railway passengers, the factory was part of the journey. The large sign, "Builders of London's Buses for 50 years, made AEC visible to people passing by. It told them that behind the walls and sheds was one of the places where London's moving identity was made. This is what industrial power often looked like in the 20th century. Not glass towers, not branding campaigns, not slogans designed by consultants, a factory beside a railway, a sign on a wall, a workforce that understood metal, engines, tolerances, and repetition, a product that went out into the world and did its job. During the interwar years, AEC developed a naming language that became part of its identity. From around 1930, its lorry models carried names beginning with M: Majestic, Mammoth, Mercury, and others. These names were not accidental. They gave weight and character to machines built for weight and work. The names sounded solid because the vehicles had to be solid. The Mammoth was not selling fantasy. It was selling the ability to move heavy loads. The Mercury was not a luxury object. It was a working tool. The Matador would become one of the most remembered names in AEC's history. AEC also introduced diesel engines across its range in the mid-1930s, an important step in commercial vehicle development. Diesel power mattered because commercial transport was always about operating cost, endurance, fuel economy, and torque. A bus or lorry is not judged by how it looks on the day it is delivered. It is judged by what it costs to run, how often it breaks, how easily it can be repaired, and whether it can be trusted after years of service. That trust became part of AEC's reputation, but the company's success was never only mechanical. It was also structural. AEC benefited from a close relationship with London's transport system. London remained a core customer, and that gave the company both prestige and a demanding proving ground. The capital was a severe test. If a vehicle could survive London, that fact meant something. At the same time, AEC was not limited to London. Its buses, coaches, lorries, engines, dump trucks, and specialist chassis served markets across Britain and abroad. After the Second World War, thousands of buses, lorries, dump trucks, and chassis for fire appliances were built for domestic and export markets, while AEC engines were used in military, marine, industrial, and other applications. This breadth made AEC important. It was not merely a bus maker. It was a commercial vehicle engineering company. Its machines worked wherever there was a need to move people. Goods, equipment, or heavy loads. Then came the Second World War. And once again, industrial Britain was measured by what it could build under pressure. AEC's wartime contribution deepened the reputation formed during the First World War. Vehicles such as the Matador became associated with military service, especially as artillery tractors and heavy-duty military machines. The physical image is easy to imagine. Large wheels, heavy chassis, engines working under strain, mud, steel, canvas, men climbing in and out, and a vehicle built less for comfort than for endurance. War work gave British vehicle manufacturers a grim kind of validation. A machine that survived war could be trusted in civilian life. After the conflict, the same engineering culture fed into reconstruction, public transport renewal, and the rebuilding of national infrastructure. In the post-war years, AEC resumed and expanded civilian production. Regent and Regal chassis returned and evolved. In 1948, AEC absorbed Crossley Motors and Maudslay Motor Company, forming Associated Commercial Vehicles, or ACV. The following year, Park Royal Vehicles and its subsidiary Charles H. Rowe became part of the ACV group. This mattered because buses are not only engines and chassis, they are bodies, seating layouts, staircases, platforms, lighting, doors, handrails, and the human choreography of boarding and alighting. The link between AEC and bodybuilders such as Park Royal placed the company inside a larger manufacturing ecosystem. Then came the machine that would outlive the company in public memory. The Routemaster, developed in conjunction with London Transport. The Routemaster was displayed in prototype form in the 1950s and became one of the most recognizable buses in the world. The local transport history. Library notes that the Routemaster became the mainstay of AEC production through the 50s and early 60s. But the Routemaster was more than a model. It was a cultural object. Its red body became part of the visual grammar of London. Its open rear platform, conductor operation, staircase, engine note, and interior details formed a memory shared by millions. It was not simply transportation. It was an experience, stepping onto the platform, holding the pole, climbing the stairs, hearing the bus pull away from the curb, watching the city through the upper deck windows. AEC did not build the whole mythology alone. London Transport, Park Royal, designers, operators, drivers, conductors, mechanics, and passengers all played their part. But AEC's engineering sat beneath the icon. That is why the company's disappearance feels so strange. The object survived in memory. The brand faded from production. At its peak, AEC had the rare status of a manufacturer whose work became part of national identity. The National Transport Trust's centenary note states that AEC built thousands of RT-type and Routemaster double-deckers for London. Transport between 1945 and 1967, the RT preceded the Routemaster, as an iconic London bus of the 1950s and 1960s, and together these vehicles anchored the post-war image of London's bus system. But success can hide vulnerability. AEC's strength was rooted in a particular industrial order. Large public and municipal operators, domestic manufacturing networks, close ties between customers and builders, and a national industry where consolidation seemed like a solution to competition. By the 1960s, that order was changing. The British vehicle industry was entering an age of mergers, rationalization, and corporate restructuring. The logic was simple on paper. Bigger groups could pool resources, reduce duplication, compete in export markets, and modernize. But in practice, mergers often created huge organizations with overlapping brands, competing factories, political pressures, industrial disputes, and difficult management problems. AEC entered this world when ACV merged with Leyland Motors in 1962. On paper, Leyland and AEC were both strong names in commercial vehicles. Together, they could have formed a powerful engineering force. But the merger changed AEC's independence. Decisions about its future would increasingly be made within a larger corporate structure. This is one of the central tensions in the story. AEC did not instantly fail because customers stopped respecting it. It was absorbed into a broader system where brand identity, product development, factory allocation, and investment priorities were no longer controlled solely by Southall. After the Leyland takeover, AEC designs began to share components and cabs across the wider group. In some ways, this was rational. Common parts could reduce cost. Shared engineering could simplify production. But it also made AEC less distinct. A brand built on its own engineering culture began to lose the sharpness of its identity. The local transport history library notes that after Leyland took control, a rear-engine successor to the Routemaster was cancelled by Leyland management, and export models were badged as Leyland. Although AEC-badged vehicles continued for the home market, that detail matters. A company can survive losing money for a time if it still controls its future. But when a company loses control of its product direction, its badge can remain visible, while its independence disappears underneath. The public may still see the letters AEC, workers may still report to the Southall works, vehicles may still roll out of the factory. But strategically, something has changed. The name is still there. The centre of gravity has moved. In 1968, the wider British Leyland Motor Corporation was created through the merger of Leyland Motors and British Motor Holdings. British Leyland became one of the largest vehicle manufacturing groups in the world, combining cars, trucks, buses, and many related businesses. The ambition was enormous. The problems were enormous too. British Leyland inherited overlapping factories, old product lines, weak finances in parts of the car business, labour tensions, and the heavy burden of trying to rationalise a huge national industrial structure. The commercial vehicle operations were not identical to the troubled car divisions, and AEC itself still had respected products. But Southall was now part of a conglomerate fighting problems, far beyond the factory gate. This is why the decline of AEC cannot be reduced to one simple cause. It was not only competition, it was not only management, it was not only labour, it was not only technology, it was the collision of several forces: corporate consolidation, changing product strategy, duplicated capacity, the fading of independent markets, pressure to rationalise production, and the financial crisis of the wider British vehicle industry. The Routemaster itself also represented a deeper transition. It was beloved, durable, and iconic, but public transport design was moving toward different priorities. Rear engines, one-person operation, accessibility, changing labour costs, and new operating models all challenged the old front-engined, conductor-operated bus tradition. The old design had emotional power, but the industry's economics were moving elsewhere. AEC's problem was not that it had never innovated. Its history was full of innovation. The problem was that, inside the Leyland system, its future innovations did not always become its own future. By the late 1960s, AEC double-deck bus production had ceased with the last Routemasters and Regent Vi types. The company continued building commercial vehicles, coaches and chassis, but the symbolic centre of AEC, London's busmaker, was no longer what it had been. The badge began to fade. There is something especially painful about industrial decline when it happens gradually. A sudden closure is dramatic. A slow decline is more corrosive. First, a model disappears. Then a name is used less often. Then a product is rebadged. Then investment goes somewhere else. Then a department closes. Then another building becomes quiet. Workers still arrive, but there is less certainty in the air. Southall survived through the 1970s, but its position weakened. The wider British Leyland crisis intensified. The group came under state control in the mid-1970s to avoid collapse, with severe pressure to restructure. The local transport history library states that Southall output slowly diminished as production was concentrated in Leyland factories in the north of England. That phrase, output slowly diminished, sounds administrative, but inside a factory, it is human. It means fewer orders passing through, fewer vehicles being completed, fewer reasons to keep every line moving, more conversations about transfers, redundancies, and whether the plant still has a future. It means workers reading signals before official announcements arrive. By 1978, the decision became clear. Commercial Motor reported in November 1978 that Leyland planned to move production of the Marathon 2 vehicle to Watford by the following June and close the AEC plant at Southall, with 2,150 jobs to be lost. The report described the move as part of a rationalisation plan, with production shifted to absorb spare capacity elsewhere and engine production moved to Leyland in Lancashire. That was the endgame. The Marathon name itself was almost cruelly appropriate. It suggested endurance, distance, the long road, and yet the final Marathon chassis became part of the closing chapter of Southall. AEC had once been the company that helped mechanise London's streets. Now its last heavy vehicle production was being moved away from the place where its identity had been forged. On 25 May 1979, the Southall factory closed, ending AEC's 67 years as a major force in British transport. Factories do not die in the abstract. They die in gates locked. Tools moved, benches cleared, signs removed, men going home without returning on Monday, apprenticeships interrupted, routines broken, and local streets losing the rhythm of shift change. The closure of Southall meant more than the loss of production capacity. It meant the disappearance of a social world. For decades, AEC had provided skilled work, identity, and continuity. A factory like Southall shaped the lives around it. Families planned around its wages. Young men learned trades there. Older workers carried knowledge that was not written neatly in manuals. Pubs, shops, bus stops, and neighborhoods absorbed the pulse of the works. When the factory closed, that knowledge did not vanish instantly. It remained in people, in former workers, preservationists, mechanics, bus enthusiasts, and transport historians. But it no longer had the same institutional home. That is one of the quiet tragedies of industrial decline. A company can close, but what truly disappears is the concentration of capability. The daily gathering of people who know how to make something complicated. The ability to pass skill from one generation to another. The confidence that a town or district has a place in the making of the country. Southall's main works were demolished in 1981. The former spares department building survived longer, standing largely unaltered after AEC vacated it. But it too was eventually demolished. The physical factory was erased. But the machines refused to disappear completely. AEC buses and lorries survived in preservation. Routemasters continued to carry tourists, enthusiasts, and memories long after regular service changed. Vintage vehicle rallies kept the badge alive. Museums and private owners restored machines that had once been ordinary workhorses. That survival is important. When a vehicle is preserved, it becomes more than a machine. It becomes evidence. It proves that the factory existed. It lets people hear the engine, smell the materials, see the proportions, and understand that industrial history is not just written in boardroom decisions. It is built into objects. AEC's legacy is therefore divided. As a company, it disappeared. As an engineering memory, it survived. The Routemaster remains the most famous symbol, but the full story is broader. AEC made buses, coaches, lorries, military vehicles, engines, dump trucks, and specialist chassis. It served London, Britain, and export markets. It built machines for peace and war. It helped move commuters, soldiers, cargo, and communities. That breadth is why the closure matters. If AEC had only been a niche brand, its disappearance would be a footnote. But AEC was woven into the larger British industrial story. Its rise showed what happened when engineering, public needs, skilled labor, and transport demand aligned. Its decline showed what happened when corporate consolidation, financial crisis, product rationalization, and changing market realities pulled that alignment apart. There is a temptation to tell stories like this as nostalgia, to say that everything old was better, that the past was stronger, simpler, more honest. But that would be too easy. AEC's world had limits. Old bus designs had economic and operational problems. Large factories could be inefficient. British industry faced real competition and real structural challenges. Rationalization was not always irrational. Companies could not survive on sentiment alone, but the opposite mistake is just as dangerous. To assume that because a factory closed, it must have deserved to close. To assume that because a brand disappeared, it had no value left. To assume that industrial loss is only the clearing away of outdated machinery. AEC's story shows something more complicated. It shows that a company can still possess skill, reputation, and useful products while becoming vulnerable inside a larger failing system. It shows that a respected badge can lose strategic power before it loses public affection. It shows that when production is rationalized, the calculation may be financial, but the consequences are human and historical. The silence at Southall is not just the silence of one factory. It is the silence left when a whole industrial model recedes, a model in which cities had close relationships with the companies that built their transport, in which public infrastructure and domestic manufacturing were visibly connected, in which the vehicles on the road carried the identity of the places that made them. Today, London still moves. Buses still run, supply chains still function. Industry still exists, though in different forms and often in different places. But the AEC story asks us to notice what changed. Once, a passenger on a train through Southall could look out and see the place where London's buses were built. The factory was not hidden behind abstraction. It was there beside the line with its sign, its workers, its noise, and its output. That visibility mattered. It reminded people that transport did not come from nowhere. It was made. It was assembled by hands. It depended on factories, skills, and decisions. It depended on institutions that could last for generations or disappear within one. AEC helped Britain move for most of the 20th century. Then the badge faded. The works closed, and the site changed beyond recognition. But every preserved Routemaster, every restored matador, every old photograph of the Southall works, and every memory carried by those who worked there keeps one truth alive. The factory may be silent, but the machines it built still speak. They speak of a time when London's movement was forged in British workshops. They speak of a company born from practical need, strengthened by war, lifted by public transport, reshaped by mergers, and finally closed by rationalization. And they leave behind the question at the heart of every lost industrial story. When a factory disappears, are we only losing old buildings, or are we losing the knowledge, identity, and confidence that once made a country believe it could build its own future? If you enjoyed this story and want to see more documentaries about forgotten factories, lost industries, and the machines that shaped everyday life, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support really helps us keep these stories alive.